Hi, my name is Roland Joffe, and to my surprise, I'm the director of this movie. I say to my surprise because when you begin a thing, you never know how it's going to end, and I suppose one prays that the end is better than the beginning. And in this movie, the beginning was already pretty good, and the end, in terms of what I got out of it as an experience, and I think all those people who worked on it, was pretty extraordinary too. It's an odd thing looking at the movie today, because this is in the year 2000 plus, and we're dealing with a subject that began some 300 years ago. And the movie is so relevant when you think what's going on in the world now. You know, Francis Fukuyama woke up one day and said history had stopped. A surprise to me, because history never stops. Neither has history stopped. And once the world stopped being divided between two polarities, where have we found ourselves? We found ourselves back in the old religious struggles, back in the struggles of civilization. What are the problems with the struggles of civilization? Well, I suppose the problem is that each civilization believes it has the answer, that each civilization defines itself by how different it is to the others, and therefore when civilizations interact, the stories that come out of it are seldom pleasant, but they are human, and it's our humanity, I think, that really touched me about this story. I wanted to make a film about what we had in common. I wanted it to be about the things that separate us, and that's the tragedy of the story, and about the things that unite us, which is the beauty of the story. And when I first heard about it, one of the things that fascinated me was that what the Indians, the Guarani, who were the tribe who lived in this part of the world, loved was music. And it was music, actually, that joined together these extraordinary people. Well, music and ambition and lust and all those things that make up human nature. These Indians, I guess that's the right word for them, that you're actually watching at this moment, they're called the Waanana. When I first met this tribe, they had never actually seen a white person. They'd heard about them, and what they'd heard wasn't very good. They'd come across a black preacher, but they had never actually had the kind of contact they were going to have with us, with a group of white people. And although they gave me a wonderful welcome, they put me to sleep with women and children. When I asked them why, they looked very surprised and said, well, where would you expect to sleep? And I said, I sort of thought I'd sleep in the man's hut. And there was a lot of giggling, and they said, well, you're not a man. Seemed slightly insulting. And I said, what do you mean? And they said, well, you're a ghost. And it struck me very clearly what it was to be the other. You see, in their world, human beings looked like them. They weren't pale-skinned, blue-eyed, bony-nosed, gaunt, strange figures speaking an odd language. So to an extent, we were a ghost, and I think that's when it began to hit me, what it is as human beings we have to battle, and the way in which we define ourselves but see other people as other. And here's a man floating down the river who believes he's been dealing with savages, who's been put into the river by people who believe that they're dealing with savages. And you know, the strange thing is that, in their own way, they're both correct. And yet, there are ways of breaking through that, as I found. I mean, I went to the Waanana for the very first time because when I'd first read the screenplay, which was written by Robert Bolt, it was very much a chamber piece. It was a sort of morality play about this particular incident which actually had occurred. But it didn't have the visceral energy that I felt it needed, and the reason it didn't have that is that, in a way, the Indians were barely depicted. When I first met Robert, he'd had a stroke, and he was ill, and he'd written this scene where a man goes over the waterfall. Extraordinary image, wonderful image, really, and a fascinating thing to shoot. We'll talk about that later. But he hadn't really understood, I don't think, the Indians, and I remember saying to him, Robert, this movie will never work unless we can find real Indians. That's not extras, not somebody we find, you know, living some awful gypsy life as third-class citizens in some country. I need to find the truth. I need to find the Indians themselves. And Robert looked at me and he said, well, good. Go and find them. Which was a great challenge. And about a week later I set off, a little like, I suppose, Altamirano, and went to find my own group of Indians. It was an odd experience. It wasn't that different to the film, really, and I think as a director, one of the most important things is to try and live as close to your characters as you can, so that everything means something. And in truth, this movie meant a lot to me. I never knew why, and I think that's a very good sign. You never know why you fall in love, really, and if you do, probably the love goes away. But I understood these men. I understood what it was they were looking for, because in our civilization, that in many ways is so deeply compromised, we have this odd idea, this sense that somehow if we only reach out into our past, we'll connect up with our future and we'll find the perfect us. Look at the way our religions are all to do with perfection. But you know, that's not the way everybody lives. There are many more people on the earth who don't believe in perfection. They don't believe that that's what life is. They just have a more balanced, maybe, view of what life is. And that's so interesting, isn't it? We die for our beliefs. We struggle to find out who we are. And that's actually what we have in common. And yet we do so much to insist that other people think the way that we do. And just like those Jesuits, I suppose, when I first went to Colombia to look for the Indians, I went with a whole lot of preconceptions about what Indians were, about how I would deal with them. And I was in for a big shock, because the place I was going wasn't at all what I expected.
Thank you, Father.
It was our territory, Julian's and mine.
I sent him, Father. I have to go up there myself.
So I found an anthropologist, and I found a wonderful guide, a Colombian Italian called Salvo Basili, who looked a bit like Jeremy Irons in a way, had a beard and was kind of eccentric and erudite in a way and knew very many things. And he said, well, there is a tribe of Indians I've heard speak of called the Wanana and the Embera, and they live on the Choco River, and that's near Cali and not far from Medellin. Colombia is an extraordinary place, you know, because it has an extraordinary history of violence, a continuing history. Pardon me, Francis Fukuyama, but history appears to be going on. It was daunting, you know, to get on a plane and realize I was going to fly into a country whose language I didn't speak, and we landed in a tiny little airfield, got into a battered Toyota, which I believe had 4 wheels, but certainly drove as if it only had 3. And we made our way down jungle trails, sort of red earth trails with bumping along and sweating, and Salvo singing and playing a terrible tune on his mouth organ. So much so I thought, my God, if the Indians actually heard this, they'd have run away. But it did set me thinking about music and themes, and I resolved that I would actually try this with the Indians. I was going to play music to them and see what happened, just to see whether this was possible. We arrived at a town eventually on the Choco River, and it was extraordinary because it was a town populated only by blacks, had an entire black population, and they all panned for gold in the river. And there wasn't really a hotel. We actually stayed in what I think was the local sort of brothel. Nobody said it was, but that's what it seemed to be. Certainly the proportion of women to men in it was rather curious. And the mayor of the town was a remarkable man. We went to see him, and he lived in a hut by the side of the river. And for the entire conversation that I had with him, where we were asking about where the Wanana were, there'd be little taps at the door, and figures would come it was shadow, it was night, and would stand outside the edge of the oil lamp, open little handkerchiefs, and there'd be gold dust in the handkerchiefs. And he'd weigh the gold dust, pay them in dollars, and pour the gold into a jar. And at the end of the evening, he gave me a jar, and it was like, I suppose it was probably like a half-litre honey jar. And in the time I'd been there, which was about 4.5 hours, it had filled from top to bottom. And I held a half-litre honey jar of gold in my hand, and this man looked at me and said, "You want to understand human beings, senor?" And I said, "Well, I do. I suppose I do." And he said, "You are holding the key in your hands." I was very touched by that, because I didn't think it was true, but I knew what he meant. Because, of course, gold is survival. And really, when you understand human beings, it's survival that you hold in your hands when you want to understand us. And when Jeremy walks through the jungle here, this is about survival too, and it's a question of what's surviving. What drove this man is what fascinated me. Yes, he wanted to take the word of God, but actually there's more than that, isn't there? He wanted to discover simplicity. I think that Father Gabriel was a man who understood that in the world that he inhabited, politicized and militarized and commercialized as it was, what he held in his heart would never be expressed. So there were 2 kinds of gold people went to look for, 2 kinds of paradises, if you like. There was the gold that was expressed through money and slaves and things you could sell. And then there's that other gold, which I suppose you could call peace of mind, the feeling that you are in harmony, the feeling that there is no reason to struggle, the feeling that you're understanding what life really, truly is. I don't know whether that's a state that can ever be achieved, but many, many people look for it. When Jeremy began to play, in fact what he played was a Marcello oboe concerto. It was Ennio later on who composed this haunting and extraordinary theme. I think that was a moment when the film is absolutely about potential. It's about, well, what are human beings? You know, are we full of fear? Are we full of anger? Are we full of violence? But we're also haunted by so many things. When Ennio Morricone, the wonderful, passionate Italian composer, saw this particular piece, actually using the Marcello oboe concerto, he turned to me at the end of the film. He couldn't speak, he was in tears, and he said, "Roland, I will not compose this film. It is impossible. To write a music for this film is impossible. The film is too beautiful." And I said, "Well, Ennio, if you feel the beauty of the film, that means it's in your heart. You have to just write what's in your heart." He said, "No, it's impossible. Anyway, I cannot write better music than Marcello oboe concerto. It's not possible." And he went away, and then he phoned up the next day, and he said, "I've been thinking, I can't get this film out of my head. Do you mind?" And he began to hum the tune, or sing the tune over the telephone. Kind of like Gabriel, there was something so innocent about this marvellous composer, nervous about whether I would approve of his tune. And you know, the funny thing is, I'm not that musical, really. I mean, I love music, but I wouldn't hold myself up as having a perfect ear by any means. And I was kind of humbled by that moment, because I thought, my God, this man knows so much more about music and is so much more exquisite in his ability to create things than I am in this area. How weird it is that I'm in a position of approving what it is that he does. And I said that to him, and there was a pause, and he said, "Yes, it's true, Ron, yes. I'm more musical skillful than you, but you have the heart." And of course, that's really what the movie is about. It's having the heart. It's a question of where does the heart reside. This scene you're watching was extraordinary because we actually played the music. This is the first time when we did this scene that this particular group of Indians, the Wayanana, had actually heard Western music. As we played them, we used the Marcello oboe concerto. We hid the speakers in the jungle. And they really heard this for the first time. They began to listen to the music, and a lot of what's going on here is genuine. You know, I barely directed these wonderful people. I didn't, you know, you couldn't do character studies and character breakdowns with them. I mean, they hadn't had any education. We barely spoke. We probably had 50 words that we could share. I mean, I can still remember Wayanana Wahapasim, which means the Wayanana are good, or the Wayanana are beautiful. It's the same word, interesting, isn't it? Good and beautiful being the same word. So they understood all of this. I mean, look at the tender way they take Jeremy here. This is them. This is what they are. Just the whole grace of the way they move, you know. You realize that extras couldn't move like that. There's just such a simplicity. This is their world. And it's a beautiful thing to see. And why is it beautiful? Well, because it's not going to last very much longer. I don't know how many Wayanana there are left, but there aren't that many. One night in the village with the Wayanana, I sat down with a drum and sort of two interpreters, and I told them the story of the mission, sitting in this huge grass hut. And people were walking about, feeding babies and wandering around, and they wore considerably less clothes in real life than they do in this film. We had to respect some Christian conventions, I think. But halfway through the story, one man got up and he started shouting, and he slapped his buttocks and turned round, and there was a mark on his buttocks, and it turned out it was a brand, and he'd been captured in 1940 and branded in 1940. It was absolutely amazing when he was young. So slavery wasn't that far away. So they understood this. They understood what Mendoza was. This is what they felt white people were. These strange ghosts who appear out of nowhere, who wreak havoc and destruction. Imagine if you were an Indian who saw somebody shot. What would it mean to you? I mean, I always felt my image for this I used sort of outer space imagery in my head. I thought, you know, what would I feel like if they came for me from another planet and they did things I simply didn't understand? So I read an awful lot about space abductions. Not because I believe in space abductions, but I believe they conveyed what it would feel like for the Indians in this circumstance, what it would have felt like for the Guarani. And the Guarani were essentially peace-loving. They had their own form of warfare, but it was very, very different to our view of it. And an awful lot of warfare, although it does involve some killing, is usually rhetorical. In other words, they know when to stop. Casualties are actually held to a minimum. That's something in the West we're losing sight of more and more. As we develop smarter and smarter bombs, it seems to me that casualties get higher and higher, certainly amongst the enemy. And this film is about that too. It's about the different ways we're going to relate to each other. And I love this first confrontation between two men who are both wrong. What does that mean, we're going to make Christians of these people? How could you be more Christian, as Gabriel in a way found out, than the Indians were themselves? It's all in the interpretation. And does being a Christian mean being a slave? Because undoubtedly slave owners were Christians. We have to accept that. This town here, so interesting contrast. This is real. This is Cartagena. Cartagena is a 16th century, early 17th century town. This is what it is. I mean, we took over the town square and made it dustier than it was. But what you're seeing is pretty much what these slaves would have seen. Can you imagine coming from the jungle to this? Well, I know what it's like in a way, because some of these people that you see here, some of these Waunana, who are being the Guarani, actually came to Europe. A little group wanted to come, and we took them to London and New York. Their comment was wonderful, because in the end they said they wanted to go home. And they said, "We really admire your people, Roland, because you are so skillful with stone. But we feel that we are people that are skillful with living things, like trees and plants. And we find so much dead material oppressive. Can we go back?" Wow, that was extraordinary. This theme of the film I find very touching, because again, it's to do with the way human beings function. It's to do with pride. So much of Latin America is to do with pride. But again, in a film about Christianity, what's the root? What's the core? This story is actually set in motion by a man's relationship with a woman he is in love with, he's sexually involved with, who's actually involved with his brother. I love the passion of that, I love the kind of archetypalness of it, because that's, again, as human beings, we have a sexual nature, and it's our unease with our sexual nature that makes us, I think, often project so much violence onto others, and that's a theme in the movie that I really liked. And I think that was a theme that Bob understood very much. The thing I think that attracted De Niro to this film, in a way, and incidentally, this man playing Don Cabeza here is Bob De Niro's landlord in New York, who I happened to bump into in the lift, and thought, my God, he'd make a wonderful Cabeza. And I said to Bob De Niro, we'd only met each other about 3 times, and I said, do you think this would be absolutely crazy if your landlord actually played the governor? And Bobby looked at me rather wryly and said, no, I think it would be a very good idea. I was going to suggest it to you. It's just quite enchanting. But I think that Bob, who's a very delicate person inside, I mean, he has this kind of rough exterior in a way, but there's a very, very noble and rather sort of honest and pure heart inside Bob, I think. I grew to like him very, 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 very much. Because of that kind of tenderness, which you can see in this scene. He had a genuine feeling for Aidan, and Aidan at that time was a young actor who'd done very little. This was in some ways, I think, the beginning of Aidan's career. I always loved this scene. I loved the way they acted together, the two of them. I just thought there was something in this image of Bob teaching his brother how to be a man, and the skill and the delicacy of the scene, and then the way all this gets destroyed. By what? By life. And again, it's an odd idea. It's about perfection again. This is a story about people who seek paradise. Aidan Quinn and Sherry Lungi, who play the girl here, they're seeking their own paradise, and that again is what fascinated me about the film so much. Is again and again the themes just overlay each other. Of course, a lot of that's the brilliance of Robert Bolt. Robert, who wrote Man for All Seasons, had been a schoolmaster, and he was a very passionate man. He had a very rich life, and I think full of women in various ways, and I think he understood men and women very well. But there was great pride inside Robert, too, and that's something I respected in him. And I pushed as much as I could for these scenes to be, developed in the screenplay, because I felt that they were crucial. That in a way, the story of Mendoza has no religious context to it at all. That the story of Mendoza absolutely is to do with a man coming to terms with himself. And that's very important, because in a way this is a film that has religion in it, But it's not really about religion, it's about human beings. It's about some human beings who believe deeply in religion, but it's a movie about love. And it's a movie about what love is. It's a movie about the pain of love, about the vulnerability of love, about the longing for peace that love can bring, or that lack of love can take away. And that's so touching again about all human beings. The Wānana live in a loving community. Religious communities are about bonding and about love. And as individuals, we look for this thing, this drive that makes us feel whole. And they're not different, are they? You know, Gabriel wanting to feel whole, Mendoza wanting to feel whole, the rage of not achieving what it is that we need. Those things are very human. I love this scene.
You need so much.
Look at that face.
You deserve so much.
And I think that's the wonderful things about Bob's performance, is it's not really the words, it's just what's there. This is a man losing control. This is a man whose head and heart are beginning to separate. And I think this is a brilliant moment. I've always felt it's one of Bob's best bits of acting ever, actually, because it's a side of him we often don't see. And I don't think that was easy to achieve. And you can feel something growing inside this man that's bigger than he is. It's almost as though in his head he knows what's going to happen. This is the other side, you know, the strange primitiveness of what happened to Christianity when it got to Colombia. You could argue, I think, that actually it was South America that Latinized Christianity. It wasn't Christianity that Christianized Latin America. And Christianity always does that, of course, because it absorbs a tremendous amount of other cultures. And I remember shooting this scene. I'd actually been in hospital because I dehydrated. We had an extremely nutty unit doctor who advised me to stop drinking for some reason I can't work out. And I lost all the salts in my body, and then I just found myself one day flat on my back with David Putnam waving a cloth over my head saying, "Roly, Roly, have I killed you?" And I wondered from it whether I'd gone to heaven. But 2 days put me right again, and I think the crew were delighted because it gave them some time off. This is Latin America as it is today. This could be Brazil. This reminded me of evenings I spent in Rio when I was misbehaving. I was younger then, and wandered about during the carnival. And I love this richness here. There's this loneliness brewing. And this is so human, isn't it? Because, you know, we drive around in our cars and we just see the surface. But the wonderful thing for me is what's going on underneath. What does it feel like? It just feels very modern to me, this whole scene. It didn't really feel like I was making a period movie at all. And I love the ideas that these things are happening with no words, but we know what's going on. We talk too much in movies. I certainly talk too much as a director, it seems to me. But then I'm here watching this movie with you, so this is kind of stream of consciousness, really. I'm just telling you what's in my head and my psyche, I suppose, as I made this film. It's amazing as I look at how much the country influenced me. I mean, this doesn't feel like a film made by a European, oddly. It's as though Colombia seeped into my bones, and I lived in Colombia for 2 months before we even sort of began the preparation of the film. So I knew these streets very well, and I loved doing the salsa. And I love the idea that human energy just builds up in so many different ways, because I wondered, what if you wanted to kill someone, if you were losing control, how would it happen? You know, do you plan it? Do you know? Do you in your deep heart of heart think, do you see the image of what's going to happen? Everybody else is celebrating, and you're drawn to something, and inside you everything is saying, don't. But then it begins to happen quicker and quicker. The die is cast, the shots get quicker. They're just the moments. And this is how tragedy begins. Everybody's doing the wrong thing, you know. Emotion takes over, and that's the truth of us. You know, however much we believe we're rational animals, we aren't. And that's our pain. We want to be rational. We want to deal with everything legally, constitutionally, in balance. But it isn't.
Rodrigo, please.
And look at the wonderful series of errors that happened here. Just a chance remark.
You left. I didn't have nothing. Most certainly you left.
Rodrigo, please.
At home you left.
Rodrigo, don't do
At home you left. Rodrigo! Forward!
Why is this tragedy happening? It's happening because nobody talks. These are brothers. And the state that Bob got himself into on that day, I think, is reflected in his face here. I mean, the loneliness of the moment when you realize you've done it, and reason comes flooding back, and what you've sort of wanted to avoid but kind of known was inevitable has happened. And I think that's such an extraordinary thing in human beings. It reminded me of a divorce. You know, I remember somebody once telling me about a divorce, and they said a very touching thing about it. They said, I kind of knew that this was going to happen, and mentally I thought I should do everything to stop it, but I didn't do enough, and it did happen. And I felt awful because I'd known it and hadn't been able to stop events unraveling. And I always thought that was a very rich and extraordinary statement about how human beings are. That's why we have to kind of be tender to each other, I think. We're not automatons. We are caught up by the fire of our emotions. That's what nature's given us, and we have to live with the consequences. And regret's such a strange thing. And that's a thing that I don't understand, I don't think. I don't regret very much, but in this film it made me begin to think about it. It made me begin to think about what would I feel if I'd done this thing. And I wanted the movie always to be about that. I wanted it to be about the fact that that strange journey that's our lives. There are so many odd things in the carriages, but they're partly our fault and they're partly the design of the carriage, but that's the way our lives are. These lives that people lead are their journey. When they die, there will be no other journey that they've lived. I don't know whether they go to another dimension. It's really, I suppose, unimportant. But in this life, this is what they've lived, just in the same way as you who are watching this film are living one life. And I suppose in a rather beautiful way, we're all talking to each other for a second, because the lives we've shown here, and something like this actually happened, you're having the chance to share. And I think that's why movies are so beautiful and exquisite, because they are a way of getting outside ourselves, more powerfully even than a novel, a way of beginning to enter another world. And the funny thing about a film, I think, is that you can't put into people what isn't there. The most you can hope for is to touch what is in people already. And I think any director begins to learn that at a point, begins to learn that, you know, your film is a conversation with somebody and the audience is a full-time player. And if the audience has the ability to understand what's in the film, they'll get it. And if they don't, they won't. It's like Mendoza and Gabriel, really. Gabriel understands that inside Mendoza, for him to feel this pain, there is an extraordinary person. There's a pure person. And when I say pure, I think Gabriel misunderstands Mendoza's pureness until the very end of the film. So at this point it's sort of easy, I think, for Gabriel, though this was a very difficult scene for Jeremy and Bob to play together. They were an extraordinary pair, the two of them, and you can see it in this particular scene, that there's two quite different styles of being here. Look at the visceralness of Bob, the kind of toughness, the waterfall, if you like, inside Bob. And with Jeremy, there's something equally felt, but it just has a completely different physical expression. And that fascinates me. Two men so different, and yet, in a way, searching for the same kind of thing in very different ways. I've made a couple of movies really that are about male friendships, and I'm very partial to them myself. I think that male friendships, for some reason, got terribly underestimated. I don't know whether one should be saying this at this time, but I think that a mistake that sometimes is made in the more feminist world that we live in is a fear of men bonding. But I think any woman has to understand that if you don't allow men to bond, The product of that is a kind of despair. Male friendship is a very important thing to males, and I think we lose it at our peril. And I never really realized this until I made the Killing Fields and the Mission, and then I realized just how important my male friends were. And that takes nothing away from my relationships with women. But it's funny how that's fallen out of favor. And yet, in truth, we all know that the value of it. And this movie is about that too, in a way. It's very much about the importance of women, because this whole story between these two men, in some ways, is generated by a woman. But at the same time, what's going on here happens to be happening amongst men. I think that's just the oddity of it. Well, these are two very brave actors, Here we are in Argentina, shooting this near the Iguazu Falls. That bundle is heavy, man, I'm telling you. Bob wanted to drag a bundle. It used to take 4 props men to get these bundles up. And this is one of the things I really adored about Bob. I mean, he's going barefoot. There are scorpions and snakes. And it was hard. I mean, these places were difficult to get to, and Bob never flinched. I think it's a wonderful thing, privilege to see, really. This bit is actually in Colombia. We keep dotting between Colombia and Argentina. We shot the lower part of the falls in Colombia, on the Magdalena River, and then the rest of it was shot in Argentina. It's a strange part about this movie. I always felt that Bob stayed a pagan. I always felt that Mendoza was a pagan. I felt his penance was pagan, and the fascinating thing is how he gets released from it, which we'll talk about later. But I love the way this group starts building together, very like the film crew. Sometimes I'd look at the film crew and think, God, we are living out this film. Here we are struggling about in the heat and the dirt and the fighting the scorpions. And I think when we'd done this scene, I just had a terrible shock because I sat on a box which moved in a rather strange way. When I opened it, it was full of tiny coral snakes. And I realized that, if I'd opened it the wrong way, there wouldn't have been any director of this movie. Well, there would have been half a director, but somebody else would have been giving you this commentary. So probably it's a good thing. But we got on so well as a crew. Liam, Bob, and one of the Jesuits called Daniel Berrigan, who is actually a Jesuit priest. He's not an actor at all. He's one of the Berrigan brothers, who was a great anti-nuclear campaigner and a very brave man. We bonded in a way that was extraordinary. The jungle can do one of two things to you. It can pull you together, or it can split you apart. Just like life, I suppose, if you see life as a jungle, it can do the same thing, and I love that. Again, that's the potential of human beings. We have a potential to socialize, and we have a potential for individuality and individualism, and how could it be any different? I suppose if you try and think of human beings as only being social, you realize nothing would happen. But if we were only individual, we'd never be able to get together to go to the moon. And this movie, in a strange way, is about that conflict, isn't it? It's about the fact that those two aspects of us, both of which are necessary, sit uneasily with each other. The individual gene battles the gene pool. All that's in this movie. Jeremy is a fascinating actor. He's got tremendous physical bravery. He had no fear of heights. And I think at certain times that used to frustrate Bob, who, like me, I think is a little bit more human about heights. You can see that Bob doesn't stint. This was a hot day, I'm telling you, and although we all knew that at the end of the day we were going to go back to have baths, there were no dressing rooms here. We couldn't afford any dressing rooms, and we were too far away for there to be dressing rooms. This little sequence is shot actually in Argentina at the bottom of the Iguazu Falls. I spent 10 days climbing around the Iguazu Falls on my own. This was the heart of the movie. The Iguazu Falls are so extraordinary. They're so powerful, and they are an absolute symbol of how puny we are and how magnificent as well. The grander nature is, and the more mankind struggles against it, the more we are two things. We are kind of nothing and everything.
We're not the members of a democracy, Father. We're members of an order.
This is real. This is in the falls. That bundle is heavy. Those rocks are sharp, and those people are high up. What we had to do was in the end, to shoot there, we had to build, I think, 1 kilometre and maybe 3 kilometres of walkways, scaffolding walkways, that went right out over some of these places so we could actually get the crew and the equipment there. My job, of course, was to make it look as frightening as possible and still keep the actors safe. Well, it does look pretty frightening. Those drops you can see down there, they're not CGI, that's where we were. Camera perched on the edge of the cliff. I'm sure Bob was having a big battle getting up there, and the bundle is heavy, and that's a long way down. But I just love the power of this. This is every mountain climber. This is every man's desire to test himself to the limits, which of itself is a wonderful thing, I think. What is that aspect we have in us that pushes us, that makes us want to push the boundaries, push the inner boundaries and push the outer boundaries? These were hard days. Funnily enough, when we made this film, it was only about 2 years, I think, after the Falklands War, which had been between Britain and Argentina over what they call the Malvinas Islands and the British call the Falkland Islands. We were being looked after by a group of Argentinian Marines who had actually been captured by the British. So there were some odd moments when I found myself dangling over the waterfalls on a rope, realising I was actually being held up by 4 Argentinian Marines who may have found great pleasure in letting a small angular Brit drop to his death into the falls. Luckily they like baked beans, so we all seemed to hit it off together. But that to me was always interesting in the film, was the underlying tensions that exist between human beings, and yet we bonded together to do something. And the film is about that too. I mean, it's about the way people bond. It's about the way we begin to unite with each other. This is also in Argentina, but it's actually quite a different part of the falls. And the question for us was, here are the Huanana. Well, the Huanana actually come from Colombia. So suddenly these people who basically have a Stone Age culture were going to get from Colombia to Argentina. That's a very long flight. So they were going to have to fly, and we had to talk to them about it. To my delight and amazement, they came, they said, because they trusted me, although they wondered if they were going to get killed. And when I said to them, why are you worried about getting killed? One of them looked at me and said, well, isn't that what your people always do, kill us? I couldn't answer that, because history seemed to be rather proving them right. This was an extraordinary moment, again, because these are people who can't read, so they can't read the script. So everything that's going on in their faces has only come out of conversation, which is being done through interpreters. So they understand the scene because of its inherent truth. What happens next, the Huanana wanted to do from the balance of their own natures. So what you're seeing in their faces is what they were feeling. This isn't really direction. This was me setting the scene up and putting them in the scene, and in a kind of a way letting it flow and just shooting what happened. Although this is what the scene should be. And I think that's why Bob got so moved. Remember, this is the man who's killed them. Remember, these are people who said to me, why do you always kill us? We will go with you, but you'll kill us afterwards. That's what's in their faces when they're watching this scene. This man represents everything they know about the white men. And it's happened to them. And yet they understand a bigger truth than that knife. That's what they understand. That's what they understand. All I could say to that particular actor, who was called Geraldo, I think, in the sort of name that we invented, was that that's what he would do. I said, cut the bundle. But I couldn't explain to him what he would feel. Like in A Strange Way, I couldn't explain to Bob. Or explain to Ennio, who had to write the music that grew out of Bob's pain. And I often wondered what De Niro touched in that moment. How many times have you seen De Niro cry? I can't think of many movies. That's Huanana they're speaking, not Guarani. So they're talking to each other. They treated things this way round. I didn't say to them, laugh. They understood that he'd come home, and that's actually what he's saying in Huanana. This was Liam's really sort of first big film, I remember David saying, "Oh, Ro, you've got to meet Liam. He's going to be a star." And when I met Liam, I thought that there was definitely something in it, and what a great career he's actually had. Those are real tears. There's no makeup there. We couldn't have got it up the cliff. The man there with the red hair is called Sigifredo, and he is actually the Waanana shaman. They don't really have chiefs. And the little boy is called Basilio. He's 11. And he really did become Bob's kind of acolyte in a way, and friend. And a very interesting thing happened for Bob on this film. Up to this point, Bob had been rather lonely, I think, and a little distant, and the crew, in truth, were frightened of him. I knew what was going on, so I had to handle all that very carefully, and I just do what I could to sort of keep relationships gentle and smooth. I don't mean that Bob did anything bad, I just mean that he exuded a kind of power that made people nervous. Once we began these sequences, there was the most extraordinary change. Bob's character just changed. The crew began to love him, and suddenly, and the Indians, the Waanana as well, began to absolutely love Bob in this thing, and the little relationship that built up between him and Basilio was really touching. And again, it's not a thing you could direct. This particular location we chose is in Colombia, and this is on the Magdalena River. That scene where they painted Bob, again, actually happened to me. The Waanana did that for me one day because I noticed somebody who had these little paintings, and I asked what it was going on. And one of the Waanana women said, "Oh, we don't do this anymore." And I said, "Well, who does it?" She said, "Well, the other tribe, our sister tribe called the Embera." She said they still do painting, and I said, "Well, that seems a pity. Then maybe I better use the Embera in the story I'm going to do." Well, the next day, they all started picking up the painting again, and this old woman started to teach the young women. This happened. This happened to me in the village. These children are being themselves. They were completely really unaware of the camera. And I think that's because very early on I got them used to cameras. I realized early on that if you just pointed a camera at somebody who didn't know what a camera was and clicked it and then put it back in your bag, they would wonder what had gone on. So I took a Polaroid, and in my first days in the village, I Polaroided myself. And so everybody came around to see what was going on. There was a little box, and it kind of went, and out came a thing, and there was nothing on it. And then I held it in my hands, and bit by bit they saw an image of me appear on the thing. And instead of being frightened, all the kids wanted to have Polaroids taken, so they all came and sat next to me. I made sure I was still there, and I Polaroided them. Then they wanted to be Polaroided separately, then the parents wanted to be Polaroided, and then I could bring out a video camera, and we videoed them, and then I brought out my little video player, and then we could see it, and bit by bit they worked out what filming was without ever quite understanding it, but they realized it was safe. And they said to me they'd like to be in the story. I explained the story was going to be done this way. We started to show them films. And they said, we'll be in this, but we're very proud of ourselves and we want to be trained to do this well because the Wānana are very beautiful. And when the little group of them first came to London when we were dubbing the film, and I got them to come to London, and they sat in the cinema and looked at the film for the very first time, and they saw themselves walking down through the jungle. There was a sort of silence, and of course they were 40 feet high. It was in a huge dubbing theatre, and suddenly one of them stood up and yelled, and he said, "Oh, Wānana, wahapasim, wahapasim! The Wānana are beautiful." That's why I never forgot the word. And he was running around the theatre saying, "Aren't we beautiful?" They'd never seen each other, of course. They were now seeing what they looked like.
Read this.
Though I have all faith so that I could remove
So this little mission that we built here, and the sense of kind of joy and paradise that it conveyed,
birds to feed the poor,
that's true.
and though I give my
These faces are what these people are feeling. You know, this is a big... Look at that baby. Aw.
and is kind,
The Wānana took all this very seriously. I mean, they really wanted to plant the banana trees, and I couldn't stop them building the mission. I mean, it was no good shouting cut. They wanted to put the roof on. Basilio, who is like a great kid... This is so much the Indians, this sense of freedom and joy. One funny cultural thing happened because the Wānana themselves, actually, the women just wear nothing but 3 beads on a sort of little rope or little string tied around their middle. And of course, I would have filmed them like that if I could, but you know, we live in a world where people get confused by that for some reason, so we had to invent costumes for them. But the strange thing was, when we invented the costumes, for some reason we could never work out, their buttocks became an immense problem for the women. So they're walking around bare-breasted, and normally they walk around wearing nothing, but because we'd put a costume on them, there became a huge thing that they had to cover their buttocks, and we could never find out where this had come from, why the buttocks were particularly important. But it made me laugh a lot about the bits of ourselves we choose to hide. You know, culture is such a strange thing. I guess what we have in common is the few basic things like we know we die, we know we're born, and we know we love. So that we have in common, and culture is the reasons we attribute for those things. So culture is just a way of interpreting things, and if you get stuck in the interpretation, then things go wrong. But if you can cut through the interpretation to what's underneath it, things have a greater tendency to go right.
Christ our King, you led Father Ignatius to renounce the snares of this world.
This is an odd quality that Bob has. He's not doing anything here, but you know this is a different man. It's just in his face. You know, compare this face to the face looking at Sherry Lungi when he realizes that he's about to go into some... I mean, his face is completely different. How does he do that? I mean, I don't know. I'm not an actor. I'm just a director. And I don't know how he does that magic, but boy, it's wonderful to see. To the left of him is Dan Berrigan. That's Basilio. Liam, of course. I think this is the real Bob, too.
Welcome home, brother.
There's a sort of shyness, an emotional shyness in Bob, which I really took to very, very much, because it goes with great warmth. And look at the dignity Basilio had. Basilio is an extraordinary boy. We'll tell you more about him later, really, because he made a great contribution to this film. I felt very close to Ray McAnally and to Altamirano as a character, because being a director is such a strange thing. You know, you're in things and you're out of them. I mean, I loved all these people, but I was responsible for them, and that used to strike me every day. I used to think, my God, you know, if something happens to one of these Wānana, I'm responsible. I've actually done this. And in truth, I began to feel that, much as I wish it would be a different thing, I suppose of all the characters in the film, I was closest to Altamirano because I was making decisions, really, that were to do with something other than the everyday concerns of the people I was dealing with. And I wanted to say things with the film. You know, I wanted to say... Well, I wanted to say something about power politics, and I wanted to say something about religious politics, and I don't have to go into that now because the film is very clear about what those things are, but all these people were here because I told them I could do it. in exactly the same, but Altamirano was there because he could make judgments on other people's behalf. And this house here is very similar to a house I actually lived in Cartagena. I walked down these streets in the evening, absorbing the town, and actually one of these houses is the local brothel, I think, and absorbing the sort of culture that was going on, the way Europeans were doing their best to recreate Europe in a world that really had very little to do with Europe. But I understood it because I got obsessed with baked beans. I don't know how many Americans know what baked beans are, but they're sort of repulsive little beans in a sort of honey sauce, which I never particularly eaten, but suddenly I got a yen for them. I got a yearning to eat baked beans, and I wanted to eat baked beans and fried eggs, which are particularly British. And Marmite. Well, you wouldn't know what Marmite is at all. Marmite's a sort of disgusting thing made up of vitamins and yeast. And I had it sent out from England, and I wasn't that different from Altamirano, who travels with his papers and his lawyers. I realized that my Marmite and my baked beans were kind of my papers and my lawyers. They were my way of saying, I'm not lost. I'm okay. I'm going to be able to get through all of this. And isn't that how we go through life? The rules we use very often are not because we are dealing with life as it is. We're just protecting ourselves against the things we think life might do to us.
Yes, Your Eminence.
Extraordinary.
What?
This view of the Indians is current today, I have to say. I had one or two anthropologists who told me nobody would ever understand what the Indians were thinking. Well, boy, I can tell you after spending time with the Wainana, I understood exactly what they were thinking. It wasn't much different to us, but there again, it's funny when we see things as strange. That sloth that's being held there by Ronnie Pickup was a great favourite of mine, because I realised that the sloth, which moves very, very slowly, lives a life in which things appear for very brief moments and then disappear, and everything is moving at double speed. It's as though the sloth lives a life where the movie is running 3 times as fast. Can you imagine that? I mean, if everybody around you was whizzing about so fast they looked like a blur. I mean, that's really why I put the sloth in this scene, because in an extraordinary way there's such a mixture of things going on here. That's what exploration was in those days. Ray, dear man that he was, had been very ill, actually, and I remember Ray really wanted to play this part, and I really wanted him to do it because I knew that he loved it, and I felt he deserved to play it in a way, and I asked a doctor who knew these things whether it would be a dangerous thing to bring Ray to Colombia. He said an interesting thing. He said, no, he said, if Ray does have as bad a heart condition as I believe, the heat is the best thing possible for him. That actually in the cold, the heart and the vessels constrict more, and heat apparently is very good for people with weak hearts. And Ray lived quite a long time after this and wrote me, his wife, I think, or girlfriend after he died, wrote me such a touching letter and just said, Ray always said, and I want you to know this is true, that this film gave him an entire new lease of life and renewed his sense of vigour and well, that's touching, isn't it? So movies work in all sorts of different ways. This scene really fascinated me because here we have literally a group of Stone Age Indians looking at people dressed like this and like that and that and singing. Well, the Wainana, in all truth, couldn't sing as beautifully as they do in the film, and obviously, we used choristers and dubbed their voices, but I have to say that they loved the music, and they sang pretty well. It's just we really didn't have time, nor did I have the inclination to do a real kind of training. And this is a scene about commerciality, isn't it? We all know this scene. This is all those decisions that are made about commerce. These are the discussions we have where we say, well, we shouldn't really do this so much, I suppose, but we have to make money. This is the scene about what happens when profit comes before people, I suppose. And the movie didn't attack that. The point of the movie wasn't to point fingers. The point of the movie was to create an experience. I wanted everybody to go into this world and just feel what it might be like to live in it, and at certain points to think, my God, it's not that different to ours.
But surely the missions will still remain under protection of the church.
Now, that is what His Eminence is.
A lot of this battling is about what? It's about oil. Well, the oil of the time was slaves and gold. And don't we have the same people now who try to ring the warning bells about what we're doing, and the same people who say, yes, but strategically we need it? Well, the Portuguese and the Spanish were fighting a colonial war here, and they needed gold, and they needed the wealth produced by slaves to build their armed forces up in Europe. Wealth has to come from somewhere.
There's no one else there. And they are not naturally animal. They're naturally spiritual.
Spiritual.
Of course, when we do exploit other people, I suppose one of the easiest ways to exploit them is to pretend that they're not really human at all. And look how long it took us to fight our way out of that particular trap. Well, we have done. But I always felt this scene was extremely modern, and in a way, in the light of the events that are going on at the moment, I think it's kind of even more modern.
They run from us.
Jeremy, in an extraordinary way, works from the outside in, and Bob, I think, works from the inside out. And by that I mean that when Jeremy eventually, who I thought was absolutely right for the part, because I thought he was such a distinctly different person to De Niro, and such a differently distinct person from De Niro's landlord, said to me that he felt that he needed to have someone with him who he could model his character on. And that's when I decided to go to Dan Berrigan, who's sitting there on the right of De Niro. And Dan Berrigan was a Jesuit priest. As I said, he was one of, I think, 3 brothers who battled against Jesuit authority. In a way, he was also a Mendoza. Dan, I think, or his brother certainly served time for pouring paint on nuclear warheads. I mean, he was a wonderful man, and not an actor at all. And when I went to see him and explained what it was, he said, well, what would I do in Colombia? And I said, well, you just make a story that I think would touch people's hearts, and also you'd be guiding an actor to really understand what Jesuits were about. Because, of course, Jesuits have had a rather checkered and beleaguered history. They did a lot more good than people have given them credit for often. And Dan decided to come to Colombia and become part of the movie. And certainly Jeremy was extremely touched. One of the ways I rehearsed with Jeremy was to put Jeremy and Dan Berrigan together for 4 days in a sort of monastery where they just spent the 4 days talking to each other. And in a way, when you see the two of them together, you can see a kind of link. You know, there's just a physical link between the two of them. Physicality is a very important thing to me. I mean, I love the governor's body language here, so sort of hedonistic in a way, and the skinniness of his assistant, or his Portuguese assistant played by Ronnie Pickup. And in a way, the diplomatness of that face of Ray McAnally, which I think is wonderful. It's really why I like these scenes. This is a story about everybody acting against their better nature. I mean, again, what people are doing, diplomacy and real politics, if you like, real politics or practical politics, demand that people go against their good nature. Another Jesuit there next to Jeremy, he actually came from Wandsworth Jail, and he was an authoritarian Jesuit who, when Britain had the death penalty, used to be in charge of looking after people who were going to be hung. And he and Dan Berrigan used to have the most sort of outstanding battles about what authority was, because they would translate Ignatius Loyola's text in different ways. Dan Berrigan would claim that Loyola said you must be true to your own heart, and therefore you had to be guided by God's voice in your heart. And his opponent would argue absolutely the opposite and say what it meant was you had to empty your heart of everything and simply obey the rules. You had to obey the law. And I used to love this debate. It used to happen over dinner, with Bobby sitting extremely quietly, Jeremy following the argument with great intensity, and this argument raging over the table, and occasionally Chuck, who plays the governor, who was Jeremy's landlord, would intervene and say, but is it really true that you guys don't have any sex at all? And I just thought this was a wonderful clash of lifestyles here. And here we all were making this film. It was extraordinary. Here, when Jeremy's talking, this is what I felt about the Indians working with us. If you listen to what he's saying.
Truly? Ask them. Ask the Guarani. 9/10 of what they earn goes back into the community, into their lives.
And of course, these were problems that we had. You know, when I asked the Indians, would they like to be in the film, and they said yes, and I asked them why they'd like to be in the film, there were 2 answers they came up with. One, they said, we like you, which I thought I found very touching. The other one they said was, we think this is our story, and we think that it should be told. Of course, they had no idea quite who was going to listen to the story. But lots of people said to me, well, how can you bring a tribe of Stone Age Indians? Why would you do this to them? And I said, what do you mean? They said, well, they'll get mistreated and people don't like them and you're changing their whole lifestyle. And I said, my answer was, well, I've asked them. I said to them, would you like to do this? And I warned them about the things that I thought would be dangers. And I said, and halfway through the warning, I realized that was ridiculous. that they were perfectly capable of understanding what the difficulties were, and they wanted to come and work on the film. And that's so extraordinary to me that so often during this movie, I was living in sort of modern terms, in some ways, what these two men were living in much more, more rigorous and different times. I was living the same thing. Because we had to deal with the fact that many Colombians really didn't like the Indians and treated them as third-class citizens. In fact, one day I was doing an interview with a Colombian reporter, a rather beautiful girl, actually, and she said, well, what's Colombia's greatest resource? And a sort of wickedness seized me, and I said, I think it's her Indians, and she stopped the interview. I mean, she literally just turned the camera off and walked off. Well, things don't change that much. This scene I always loved in a way because of the boy. You see Basilio just standing behind Bob. He was a very interesting character. He's 11, and if ever there was a born actor, Basilio was. Here's a question I would ask you, I suppose, thinking about culture, but when you look at that boy, or you look at Bob and Jeremy, and we understand they're actors, and we understand, that they've read the screenplay, and they've worked out the logic of the story and the logic of their characters and the things that we're trying to say. But Basilio's an 11-year-old Indian. There he is standing next to Jeremy. And yet his acting is as pure and as beautiful and as in the film as anybody else. So how, if you watch the scene, this was my fun in the scene, could you believe for a second that because a culture is not civilized in our terms, that we believe that it's primitive? Primitiveness would imply that you don't understand human emotions, but Basilio, this 11-year-old boy, understood everything. We'll see him again in a moment, but in this scene, he wasn't bored in this scene. This kid watched this scene and grew to love Bob because he began to understand that Bob was defending the Wanana, were defending the Indians, and the Wanana took that as modern. You can see from Basilio's body language, there he is.
And I ask for your pardon.
Brilliant little moment. That's Wanana, that boy was talking. He understood that moment. Look. You can't fake that kind of almost little half smile. And I loved that kid for the kind of purity of his emotions. And he, he's grown up now, but at a certain point he came to us and decided, he said he wanted to go and live in New York with Bob. And of course I was totally against that, because I think that would have been like a terrible thing to do. But he really wanted to go, and we had quite a tough time with him, saying that, we didn't think that was exactly what he should be doing. But we certainly provided the Wanana with not really with money, because we felt that though they had a bank account that they could use for legal things, that the money that we had was used for the following thing. They created a federation, which was called the Federation of the Wanana and the Embera of the Lower Chocó. And they got some kind of agreement from the President of Colombia that they would be allowed to live in that jungle. And what they said was, you look after things that fly in the sky and that run along roads, and we look after things that grow. This is the way God has intended for it to be. Let us live in our jungle to tend the things that live. I mean, that was their letter to the President. And that letter was written in 1985, and we're looking at a film that was 250 years before that. This mission, it looks like it's been there for a long time, hasn't it? This is the invention of Stuart Craig. Stuart's a brilliant designer, in the same way that Chris is a wonderful cameraman, and I think when you create a movie, what you try to do is to get the spirit to shift from one soul to another. That's a set. It's difficult to believe, isn't it? But that's a set, and that it's based on what was really there. But Stuart managed to magic that out of a hillside in a jungle. This isn't a set, this is a church. This is a real church. But what a wonderful way to combine these two things. Here are the Wanana in a church. And these are the people that you saw in the village. These are the same people. And Stuart and Chris, I thought, made a wonderful team because they're both very practical. Nothing daunted Stuart. I mean, Stuart was the kind of man who would say, if he went into a building and you'd look at it, he'd say, well, let's go up here. So you'd find yourself clambering up some staircase and some rickety old ladder to look at the building from the top. Or if there was a mountain, you would always find yourself with Stuart just crossing to the other side, just in case what was on the other side was better. And Chris, the cameraman, had the same thing. Chris had lived in the jungles of Thailand and Burma, I think for about 4 or 5 months, which is one of the reasons I really respected and liked Chris, and shot some wonderful things on the Karen and the drug lords. And Chris has a wonderful sense of of light. I'm a difficult director to deal with because I pick the lenses and the movement of the camera. I won't allow anybody to kind of interfere with that in I suppose, a kind of autocratic way. But I think it's because I believe I know how I want to tell the story. So for me, the designer, the set designer, and the cameraman have to have a feeling for the light, a feeling for what the light is telling us about where we are. And I wanted this film to have the most extraordinary warmth to it. And Chris had to work very hard, shifting lighting conditions to create this kind of odd glow that I wanted the movie to have. It's almost as though you've gone to some place that doesn't exist, because in a way it sort of doesn't exist anymore. And Stuart, I think, understood that, and also knew how to be simple. Some of the sets we use are just made out of trees and one twig, really, and they're just as fascinating as some of the great missions and things that he built. But Stuart has a really, really great eye and is never fazed by anything, and that's what you need when you're doing a film like this. I mean, imagine it. You're in a completely different country, you don't speak the same language, you need this kind of detail. All these things have to be made. Well, they were made by Colombian craftsmen. And isn't it fascinating? This is really what the film is about. The film is about finding yourself in a strange place and beginning to understand what's there. It's always about the clash of civilization, isn't it? Because not all civilization is bad, actually. Much of what we've created is in its own way exquisite and beautiful. So you can't really say what one thing is, because both things are true. You can only look at the way they interact. Look at Basilio, isn't that fantastic? He knows exactly what he's doing. I always thought this was a brilliant, brilliant set. It's kind of, I think, was the biggest set in the film, and it was important that, though it wasn't in the movie that long, it's important that it conveyed just how grand this vision of the Jesuits was. I mean, these people went, and they built these things in the forests of Argentina. Monirac Sisworth, that's the man playing the priest there, was actually in the killing fields, believe it or not. He played the Khmer Rouge leader in the killing fields. He's actually King Sihanouk's cousin. I think, of course, he's now in Cambodia, returned to Cambodia. But at that stage, poor man was down and out because his country had been completely destroyed. He's not really an actor at all, but I discovered he was, struggling in Long Beach, so I asked him to come and be a Guarani priest, which tickled him a lot. And he's a delightful man. And again, that's a lovely thing about films, that, you make friendships that endure.
And I suggest that you and I together advise your king to postpone the transfer of the mission territories until we get guarantees from the Portuguese for their survival. And I suggest that
earlier, if you hadn't fallen asleep when I was, because I know what time of night you're listening to this movie, you might be watching this very late. But if you are still awake, if you remember, I was talking about the Indians when they came to Europe. They were very struck by our skill with stone. I hadn't thought about that until after the movie, but if you look at where we are with the Western civilization and where we are with the Indian civilization, you see it totally. One is dominated by trees and the other is dominated by stone. One is about hardness, rigidity, shape, geometry, balance, rigidities, and the other is about curve and movement and light sliding from leaf to leaf, and about hidden things, and about secret streams, and about quiet, and about creatures that lurk, that slide, that jump, that leap, that bite. Such completely different worlds, aren't they? And when the Indians had come to Europe, a group of the Wana had come to Europe, and they stayed with us for a little bit, and they asked to go home. And they said that one of the reasons they wanted to go home was that though they felt that we were very, very skillful with stone, they found it very difficult to spend so much time amongst something dead, and they wanted to get back to their living trees. And quite unconsciously in the movie, we'd recreated that. And that's why I put this scene actually in the mission garden. I didn't want this particular scene to happen indoors. It's a mixture. This is a tree, but the tree is in the mission. So the tree's been tamed, but nonetheless, it's a bridge moment. Why was that important? Because Altamirano is about to have his heart broken. And the decision that he makes is about to happen very soon. The strength and the beauty of Altamirano, I think, is that he is a politician, but he's not a bureaucrat. And the elegance of his character is that he doesn't shift from understanding what it is he's going to do. I think many politicians would not care to stare into the face of those that they're about to destroy. And the strength of Altamirano is that he's prepared to do that. And look where he prays. The Indians pray in the forest. Their gods are in movement and they're flexible and they behave like the creatures of the forest. This is so grandiose, isn't it? So huge, so brooding. That's the way religion was at that time, maybe the way that it is. I loved shooting this scene. This was Stuart and Chris Menges at their best. It was an extremely hot night. We were behind on that particular day, but I always thought there's something about the patience of this, waiting with the flame, waiting with life, waiting to be protected. And here's such a strange conflict, because who are the people who want to be protected? Well, they are the Waanana. They're the Guarani. They are the Indians who conventional history would tell us were being distorted and destroyed by the Jesuits. I read the letters, and there are originals of these letters that the Guarani wrote to the Pope. And in that letter they do say, our father, big great father I think they say, we have only found happiness with our Jesuit brothers, and we wish to stay in the missions. We wish to live this life. And that was a wonderful surprise, wasn't it? Because conventional wisdom would tell us that they wanted to live in the jungle, or they wanted to live in their forests. But remember that even Western civilization at this time was different. The gap wasn't quite as big as it is now. I mean, look at the gap now, you know, the gap that the Waanana had to deal with. Cars, aeroplanes, computers. At that stage, 300 years ago, the gap was narrower. And people entertained themselves in different ways. I mean, these people entertained themselves with music and with dancing. Well, just like the Guarani do, or the Waanana did. I was introducing technology, cameras. Boy, that was a big gap. So you see, history is like a spiral. We think it goes round in a circle. Actually, it's not. It's a spiral. You go back to the same place, but you're slightly higher. I guess sometimes slightly lower. Here we are back on the Magdalena River. There's a lot of skill, you know, paddling those canoes. I tried it and fell in 3 times. And this is what they would have done in those days. You know, I travelled by plane and bus, and, well, I did travel on the back of a log once. But this is how they made the journey, down the river. I love this moment because I think Ray was genuinely in awe. And there's Dan Berrigan sitting in a canoe, delightful. There's Baselio paddling. Look at the skill there. I couldn't do that. I couldn't balance on a log like that. So for all my kind of computer skills, I just had different skills to theirs. This was just about awe. This was about, yes, the Garden of Eden. Whatever the Garden of Eden may be, and that has a checkered history. This moment is very close to what I felt when I first came across the Waanana village. We'd been going down by canoe, curious enough, bigger than this, but going down the Magdalena River. And we came around a corner, and I just saw one fisherman in a boat, and my heart stopped. It's the first time I'd actually seen a completely different culture. There was an Indian, a Waanana Indian. And he looked at us and then scuttled away in his boat. And we paddled on round the corner. And I came to the village. It didn't have a bridge like this, but suddenly the banks were full of people, running and giggling and laughing and pointing, and they didn't run away. I was an oddity, absolutely, but they were intrigued and puzzled and fascinated. It was the most delightful moment, and I wanted to recreate it in this scene because I wanted people to feel what I'd felt, what it's like to come across a people who welcome you, that's their nature. They don't run away and they don't attack you. And this music is really Ennio at his best, I think. Morricone is a wonderfully passionate composer, and this, I think, is one of the best-selling movie scores there's ever been. You hear it all over the place. I've heard it in aircrafts and in supermarkets, and it's a wonderful thing, and it's a great testimony to Morricone's spirit. We worked very hard together, and we discussed the music forever. We worked with a choir in London, and I realised one thing when we were working with the choir, because we didn't want them to be perfect, because in a way they had to represent what the Guarani might have been able to do. And I realised that they were singing but facing away from the screen, and Ennio was looking at the screen, you know, watching the marks for the music cues while the choir was singing. And I suggested to Ennio that we make a change, that we turn the choir around and get them to look at the screen and we move where Ennio conducted. And Ennio thought it was a great idea, and it did wonders for the choir. Suddenly they got into the story, and the quality of their singing began to change. This little musical interlude is Waonana. This is we didn't interfere with this. This is this man here who plays the chief. In actual fact, is not a Waonana. He came from Argentina, and an odd thing had happened because the Waonana asked me if I would become a tribal chief, which was very touching. But I said to them, I didn't want to do that. A, because I was a white man, and I didn't want to patronize them. And why would they want that? And they said, well, you are so good at organizing, and we want to organize a political association. So I said, well, that would be a very, very bad move, and I would probably come up with all the wrong decisions, and they were capable of doing it on their own. But what I would do would find an Indian from another tribe who was experienced in these matters and get him to do the organization. Well, of course, the Colombian government wouldn't have been that happy, I suppose, if they knew I was doing that. So I went and looked in Argentina, and this gentleman here walking along with Ray McAnally was, in fact, the Secretary General of a transnational Indian group. And when I met him, I talked to him, and I said, if you really want to work for your people, why don't you bring your family, come to Colombia, and rediscover your history? Because, of course, he's a city-dwelling gentleman and, as au fait with modern civilization as anybody else. And bless him, he decided to do that. And I said, and the Waonana will probably come to you with a request to organize them politically, and I approve that. I think it's a great idea. I just don't want to know about it. And that happened. And during the whole of this film, they were having discussions about how to protect themselves in the future against the ravages of what may happen to them if the Colombian government didn't heed their requests. So during this film, while we are making this film about history, the Waonana Indian actors in this movie are protecting their own future against a different fate, but not that different. This is a scene about understanding for me. This is a scene where the pomp has gone, the grandeur has gone, the stone has gone. It's about this. It's about wrestling, which is what the Waonana do. It's about this little boy. I mean, that kid understands what's going on. Look at the body language here. Have you ever seen such relaxed... I mean, these are women with an immense relaxation. Look at the intelligence, what a great way to grow up. I kind of wished I'd had a childhood like this. God, I thought I had a great childhood, but I watched these kids diving in the river and watched the spirit, and all of these are things I used to see every day in the 2 weeks that I went and lived on my own with the Waonana. This was the way they spent their mornings. Coming back to London was a bit of a shock. And when I described all this to Robert, sitting there as he sat there with his stroke, and he would say, oh, good, describe it to me and we will put it in. And, of course, it all went in, and I think that's maybe something that gives the film its own strange quality. It just doesn't feel like a normal film to me, and I think it's because... There's Dan Berrigan. Look how Jeremy and Dan sort of have something in common. That's because they've spent so much time together. I mean, they really do. That's acting. It's about absorbing.
Show its authority over the Jesuits here. I still couldn't help wondering whether these Indians would not have preferred that the sea and wind had not brought any of us to them.
Sometimes I think, oh, what have I done? Have I really disturbed this tribe? The more I began to think of it, the less. And this scene is why. This scene is completely improvised. What the Waonana are saying in this scene is in Waonana. Jeremy learnt Waonana enough to understand what they were going to say.
They must leave the mission.
And this scene, I think, was incredibly important because the decisions being made in this scene were being discussed by the Waonana off the set, so to speak. And what they're saying here is they're saying you can't trust white people. They'll only work for their own ends. They'll do things that you don't understand. Their hearts are hidden. And the best thing to do, says this old man, the one in white is going to talk in a moment, and he actually says the best thing to do is to kill them now in the hopes they'll never come back again, like we threw that man in the cross down the river. We can't trust these people. Why, one of them says, and he says because they don't trust themselves. That's a damning statement, isn't it? But probably not untrue. Isn't it odd, though, that this scene that we were doing was a mirror of what was actually going on outside the scene in the set? See, this man talking is an Argentinian who spends his whole life working to protect Indians. That's Giliberto, who is a Waonana.
God, that they came out of the jungle and built the mission. They don't understand why God has changed his mind.
I cannot hope to understand God's reasons.
Now these men,
How does he know you know God's will?
how does anybody know God's will? Look at that face. This man knows what he's talking about. He's talking about now. He's not talking about then.
I do not personally speak for God.
And what is this God?
For the church,
And what is this church?
instrument on earth.
Well, you know, that's what the movie's about. You understand you understand what Altamirano is doing, and he has good reason for it, but we understand what they're feeling too. This is the danger with paradise, you know, we lure Indians into our paradise because we tell them it's paradise and that's what civilization is, and then it turns out to be hell. Well, everybody's paradise is different, I suppose.
He is also a king.
This was my favorite line. He is also a king, and he also will not listen. Good stuff. I remember telling Robert that was my favorite line. He just chortled. Robert was an extremely passionate writer, and he'd been a school teacher, so he understood a lot about bureaucracy, and I always felt he based Altamirano on his old headmaster. We always have to base characters in something.
Well, then you must persuade them not to fight.
I failed to persuade you to fight on.
I thought Jeremy handled this scene very well, and in a way,
Do fight.
I think the actors discovered a sort of truth because they genuinely like the Wayanana, and this went right back to the reason why I'd said to Robert we should put real Indians in, because I felt that with the real people,
Tomorrow.
nobody would have to act. The emotions would be very true because they would be sitting in front of our eyes somehow, and we would be making friendships,
Cast out.
and friendships were made. Basilio, who's going to come back in a rather important moment, understood something. This is a great question. Why must they fight? Why must any of us fight? It's because it's in our nature as human beings not to compromise that essence, you know, that thing that we feel is ours. Curious, isn't it, human beings? I mean, think of what's going on in Palestine and Israel at the moment. Where's the difference? Well, yes, there are some superficial differences, a different country, but, you know, the same thing going on. Two nations both claiming a homeland, but actually they're fighting for the same thing. They just have got on different sides. Why? Well, because of culture, I guess. But I watch the news frequently and read about what's going on in that part of the world, and this film comes back to me. There aren't black and whites. The greys can be terrifying, and I think one of the strengths of this movie is that it's not afraid to plunge us into the grey. And I think that's the beauty of the movie. It doesn't say the black and white is this. It has its sympathies, that's for sure. But its sympathies are wide-ranging, and they're, in a way, for all human beings. Basilio, remember, a boy with whom, you know, I didn't share a common language, and that was cold. Brave little kid. Because that was icy, that water. I actually went in the water as well, because I wasn't going to have Basilio going in the water if I didn't. So I got frostbite, virtually. Which is more than Basilio, but he understood what all this scene was about, and I think there was something rather beautiful happened. Bob, as an actor, will only respond if he feels something real is happening. And something real is happening inside this boy. He understood what it was that he was supposed to be doing, and in this scene, I'd said to Bob, don't take the sword unless you feel that you have to, which is the way Bob would act anyway. And this scene, actually, which is quite short, took about 50 minutes to put together, because we just kept on doing it until Bob could not resist taking the sword. And the most I could say to Basilio was, you know, if this was today and the Colombian police were coming for you, what would you do? Well, he knew what he would do. And I love this moment because here is the conundrum. Yeah, maybe this is God. Maybe God is in this moment, I don't know. This is a man who understands violence, and violence may be necessary. Can you argue that it never is? I don't know. I don't have the answer to that. Neither does the film. It can only describe what is. So I found those moments incredibly beautiful. You'll also notice that the dialogue begins to disappear. I think Robert Bolt and I very much felt that towards the end of the film, words were becoming less and less important. You know, there'd be a scene between Gabriel and... But the die is cast now. Now it's the time for pictures. This advice is all improvised. They're telling him to fight. The old man in white, who's actually is another shaman, was very, very firm that the battle had to be. And that was important because I wanted Bob to play these scenes understanding the rightness of what he was doing, because the Indians are asking that he does it.
I want to renounce my vows of obedience.
Get out.
I want to explain.
Get out, Rodrigo. I won't listen to you. Just you?
No, it's Ralph and John, too.
What do you want, Captain?
Poor Jeremy.
They want to live
Arriving at the point of understanding.
They say that God has left
See, even with God on your side, not everything is under control. The big shock, I think, for a man of Gabriel's belief, what he felt was so certain,
But I am a priest.
just isn't.
Then help them as a priest.
Everybody reaches their moment of confusion.
If you die with blood on your hands, Rodrigo, you betray...
He's right, but he's wrong, isn't he? And he must be asking himself, why did I find Mendoza? I remember talking to Dan Berrigan about this and saying, what would you have done, Dan? And Dan said a very interesting thing. He said, well, I would have wondered why it was that I picked Mendoza and brought him here in the first place, that maybe God is seen in that movement too. Although I can't support it, I also would have to understand that there are things beyond me. I thought that was very extraordinary. And the movie is about that. The movie is about uncertainty, in a way. Now everything's got ambiguous. The die is cast. Things have taken over. Individual things don't count anymore, just individual experience. But nothing can stop the movement, it's too late. The water is going over the fall. The destruction begins. Why? Because when it begins, it's unstoppable. I think of the bombing of Yugoslavia, I think of the Croats fighting the Serbs and the Serbs fighting the Croats. They all went through this moment, didn't they? When suddenly things couldn't stop, and they did the same thing, didn't they? If we're to believe the photographs that we see, people were herded out of their homes. Suddenly people have to be shot. Why? Well, because the Croats are Catholic and the Serbs are Orthodox and the Bosnians are Muslim. Well, it's not greatly different from what's going on here, is it? That's the modernity of these things. I love this moment. I asked the Indians what they would like to do, those who would like to stay with Gabriel and those who would like to fight. And I absolutely left it to them to choose. There were 300 Wayanana, and I think they split just about equally, with those who decided they would stay with Gabriel and whatever Gabriel wanted to do they would do, and those who decided to fight. And I thought that was a very passionate, interesting moment too, because this is the way it would have happened. These are the way we make our decisions. Not all human beings are the same. The staging of this was an extraordinary thing, because this is shot in Argentina, these shots. So they're shot, 4,500 miles away from the stuff that we shoot in Colombia. So I had to remember all the rhythms, because the camera move to me are tremendously important, the way the shots open up, the sense of foreboding. Boy, that water was cold. And the staging of this was really complicated just because the logistics of everything was a nightmare. Oh, well, actually, that's not true. I loved it. But, all those things that you see, the cannons, or the actors, or the food, it all had to be sort of humped down cliffs and carried backwards and forwards. And I think people cursed me a lot during this period because I insisted that this is where we should do it, and I could watch people. I helped where I could. I mean, I at least carried 3 cups of coffee. But I wanted this feeling. This scene wasn't originally quite conceived in this way, but De Niro's knife was sort of important. It's a tiny detail, but it's the similar thing to what he killed his brother with. He originally killed his brother in the original script with a sword, and I wanted it to be with a knife. because I wanted the knife to come again in this scene, because he couldn't kill the man with the sword, but in this scene he has to use the knife again. But of course now it's a completely different thing that's going on, or is it? I don't know. I guess that's what the movie is about this moment. Because it's exciting and it's visceral. This is a man who's vowed never to kill again. This is a man who has actually killed his own brother. What does it mean that he has the ability to kill? Seems to be a way of saving now. Interestingly enough, the water is so loud that this scene is quite conceivable. I had to take the sound of the water down a bit because we needed the music. But the water was so loud you had to use sign language virtually. Here we go. Now we go back. Shooting this film made me ask an odd question of myself, and I thought we often think that violence is, and our ability to kill is something inhuman. But I began to wonder if nature doesn't do a very extraordinary thing. You see, nature, in a way, provides us with the ability to do everything. Why is that? Well, because nature doesn't know what's coming next. So smartly, nature must try and create a creature that's as adaptable as possible. Which means to survive, it may be necessary for this creature to be able to kill. So I began to feel that the point was not to hate us for being able to kill, but to understand it's a privilege we have that we have to use with care, but that we shouldn't hate ourselves for having it. I think that's what I learnt making this movie, really. To look on it in a very different light, and to not go into that sort of rather Poe horror that people have of death and of killing, but to understand what it may stand for, what it may count for, and to understand that the privilege is that we have the ability to do it. Since we have the ability to do it, we should understand truly what it is. Boy, it's a complicated thing, life, isn't it? These are brave men. They are actually going up this cliff, and this cliff is about 350 feet high. And it reminded me very much of, this was the cliff I hung over the edge while the Argentinian Marines held me. So you can see my faith was justified. Again, I wanted kind of this idea of different technologies. The Western thing is always, it has a rigidity to it, and it's, already there are the cannons and the technology and but a lot of guts. I mean, these were brave men, these soldiers. What they were going to do, I think, was pretty horrendous, but you can't take away from them the fact that, so that's why I wanted to see them scaling the rocks. I wanted people to feel, my God, would I have done that? So although what they're about to do is an ugly act, these are not people who have no courage. The choreography of all this was really complicated, because we're shooting, this is back in Colombia, so now these sequences are shot, 5 weeks, 6 weeks earlier, actually, than the other stuff that you saw. So trying to choreograph for the large movements of people in the jungle requires a lot of pre-planning, really. I storyboard everything, so I draw every scene, and that's in the end the only way to keep a handle on what's going on. And then I go again with my storyboards and go and look at the locations and work out how they'll work. And sometimes I look at the locations and then do the storyboards afterwards, and you can never really tell. Now we're getting into our last moments of dialogue, really, because words have become less and less important. It's really just the eyes that matter now. When we were doing this scene, oddly enough, Bob asked if he could play it with me. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, because this is like my farewell, and I really love you, so I want you to be Father Gabriel. I didn't think that would go down too well with Jeremy, so I declined the offer. But I was kind of touched by it. And it shows that, we've been in the jungle for a long time. Well, I say we'd been in the jungle. The hotel was about 35 kilometres down the road, and it was a very nice hotel with a swimming pool and colour TV. And many people would have seen it as a kind of holiday resort. So although the movie looked as though we were in the middle of nowhere, we weren't quite. In fact, this scene, for all its delicacy, is 1.5 kilometres from the main Venezuela-Colombia highway, which ran right along the coast, so there was no way you could avoid it. This is an important moment for me. It's the moment when you realise these men are two halves of the same thing. They are both necessary. There is all of humanity in this embrace. And that's what Ennio's theme is about. Ennio's theme is about reconciliation. It's about understanding that we're not separate. We're not separate entities. We're not black on one side and white on the other. All this is human. And each person is finding their own humanity and their own meaning. Each symbol has its own meaning. It will for you, and it certainly did for the actors, and it certainly did for the Wānana themselves. The choreography of all this was sort of wild to do. We were already slightly behind, so we had to kind of do this. We were shooting this stuff incredibly quickly, and also we were preparing to burn the mission down. And one of the sad things I knew was that when we lit the mission, it was going to burn, and that was it. There was going to be no going back. We weren't going to be able to rebuild anything. This is so Wānana as well. I mean, they're pretty brave people. And I love the physicality of all of this. I mean, I find these people beautiful, and I think just the grace that they go down the river, and the tenderness of physicality, so strong and so vulnerable. And that's really what this battle's about, in a way. It's about inevitability, but it's about struggling with inevitability, which I guess is the truth of being a human being. It's just the grace with which you deal with what is to be that I think separates one human being from another. I love the determination of these people. They chose to fight. I mean, they, in their own minds, they know. And Basilio was so proud. He didn't know what is going to happen now. He didn't know was going to happen. And he did not like it. I told Bob just to do this. He's pissed. But I told him it was going to be okay, he'd have a chance. He said, I'm a man, and therefore I can go and fight. This is about steel, about the different ways you go through the jungle. And I did my share of both. I once came back when I got in a bit of the jungle I couldn't get out. I had to come back on a logging lorry, which went through the jungle very like this, where they were just cutting swathes of roads. I was on a 70-foot long log that was about 22 foot thick at its bottom. Watching what had been done to this wonderful jungle, which had been sliced, with great red earth roads and trucks and... Well, this speaks for itself, really. It's also about imagination. They make a cannon, and they did. They made a cannon out of wood. And it's about planning. It's about all the things directors have to do, really. You have to lie in wait and lure the producer into a trap. Try not to decimate anybody. This day was quite interesting, actually, because there was a strike on this day, which I'll go into in a minute. But as this camera pans round, I think if this is the shot that I think it is, right at the edge there, you can't see it, but you'll see it a bit later, there is actually the highway that separates the bottom of the Magdalena River from where our mission was, which is, as I said, the main highway that bisects, that travels from Colombia to Venezuela. And of course we couldn't get rid of the highway and we couldn't stop it, so in actual fact we had to hang camouflage netting over it. And shooting a battle on water is a nightmare because water doesn't stay in the same place. In other words, where do you put the camera? Well, you can't mark anything, you can't. So you have to create a whole different kind of poetry. It means there has to be an awful lot of wading around. So I spent an awful lot of this particular week in the water. I mean, these shots are okay when boats are just going backwards and forwards and away from us, but you wait to see when the battle starts, and the camera has to go on a crane, which we put on a raft in the middle of the water, so we could sort of scoop up and down and sideways and fly around. Very difficult to cue, because the water has a habit of not stopping. So actually what I did was I worked out a way of using markers. I anchored some canoes so they didn't actually move, the theory being that if the camera moved you wouldn't notice that the canoes weren't moving, and we used those canoes as our marking points. And in fact you can't tell, and because we had that we could strategically work out where we're supposed to be, and in actual fact the shots would flow one after the other. But until I'd come up with that ruse, there was a real panic, because this is a very fast-flowing river. So, you'd get the camera into position, and then the little anchor you'd put in would just pull out of the thing, and the camera would go whizzing off to the north, and the actors would be coming down from the south, and the two would just go right past each other. You'd have to wave goodbye to each other, but you couldn't get a shot out of it. This is all about physical strength. Such a different kind of battle, isn't it, to running around with a 6-gun? Or flying in a Black Hawk helicopter and shooting people with high-speed cannon. This music's so passionate. I mean, this is Ennio, in a way, at his best, I think, who somehow caught the heart of everything, caught the kind of tragedy of all of this. Sometimes I'd imagine that I would fly up into outer space, and what it would be like if you saw all this from outer space, you know, these tiny little ants living out these passionate moments, but space just goes on immutably. Doesn't help, of course, if you're down here, but that's what directors think about sometimes. Aside from the fact about, you know, that extra, where did they find him from, and has he been at the gin bottle? Of course, the weather didn't help, because everything is extremely moist, so to actually try and get things to explode, Vic Armstrong, who was our stunt organiser, he's a brilliant stunt organiser, we had terrible trouble with the armaments and also with these arrows. You know, because arrows were actually flying through the air, and it's not very nice to get on the wrong side. And some of this got a little stronger than it should have done between the Indians and the Colombians at certain points. Also, a battle needs to keep emotion. You know, I wanted it to be very much about human beings. I didn't want to shoot this as a conventionally, you know, sort of blood and guts battle. I wanted it to sort of be about consequence all the time, which in a way it had to be. So I wanted it to have a kind of rising horror and something very personal to it. And at this stage, everybody acts the same way. You know, the early part of the film that shows you what happens when control is gone. After all, war is loss of control. Are mirrored here, when the Wa'anana are just as incapable of stopping as anybody else. You know, once these things begin, they begin, and they're going to have to play themselves out. Logistically, we had big problems here because these battles and all this is a typical shot here where we have to have some canoes moored and some canoes moving, because everything is in flux. But in these shots, although they look like they're all in the same place, they're actually shot about 3,500 miles apart, and a lot later. So, you know, one shot you'll see in one place and one is another. In fact, you can't tell. That's what I mean about the consequences. I didn't want us to be swept up in the delight of battle. I mean, so many movies I see, and you know, the war sequence becomes a grand sort of guignol thing, and everybody's really participating in the killing without really working out what's going on. That couldn't be in this movie, so we had to break a few rules and sometimes stop the flow of things, so you saw individual moments of cruelty and then individual moments of courage. This event actually happened. I mean, one of the priests did this. Extraordinary thing to do, really. You can see from Liam's face, this is pretty real. The current is hard. Making those canoes move through the water is hard. We all got pretty tired by the end of the day. And then another way of being. Basilio gets his chance. He was very happy. And that was touching too. To me. For some reason I watched this scene, it always makes me think of Milosevic and what he thought he was doing with his ethnic cleansing. Maybe he'll explain to us. Sometimes people don't want to do things, but we've learnt to accept orders. Maybe that's in our natures too. There were never any bows like this. I invented these. I just thought it was a rather fun idea. And that was to do with working out what the battle was. You know, how would they burn the mission down? And I just like this weird mixture of cultures. And they really worked, these arrows. I mean, They were quite capable of doing this. So those arrows you saw flying were actually shot out of those bows. We didn't have enough equipment with us to sort of fire them out of cannons or anything. These rapids and the choreography of this, of course, have to be very carefully done. This is actually shot in Colombia, and since I'd explored the Iguazu Falls, I realized that you couldn't take canoes very close to the falls. The rush of current is so strong, we'd have lost somebody over the falls without doubt. I mean, there'd be no way you could rescue them. So I had to find bits of river and way of putting this together where it felt it was all in the same place. And so if you see the cuts done very carefully, the water gradually gets whiter and whiter and whiter. And you get this growing sense of doom, but you're actually moving through Colombia. It's quite dangerous what they're doing. Now you're actually in Argentina. So we've now moved 3,500 miles between these two shots. This is actually in Argentina, but you wouldn't know because of the way I tried to grade the white water with, in the jungle. If you look very carefully, you'll realize the vegetation's slightly different. But by this time, it doesn't matter. Now we are actually, again in Argentina, we're on the top fall. This is getting now quite near a big fall, but not the biggest fall. We use no special effects here. I mean, this is what they're doing is what they're doing. You see that fall there? That's a real fall. And this is a real fall. This is the camera over the Iguazu Falls on a crane. Whoops. That's the fall. That isn't. That is. That's the camera on a crane. 3 cameras turning on this thing. God, how do we do that? Well, we actually built a small bridge and chucked a guy off it so we could just cut all this stuff together with water pouring down. They loved me by the end of all of this, I can tell you. Now we're back in the mission, of course. That fire that you see there is now going to get out of control. And we had only the time, we could only burn it down once because we knew we couldn't stop it. So all this stuff had to be laid up front. And we had to get the fire to just the right point because I'm responsible for all these people's lives, remember. And can you see the fire? Well, you'll see it at the back. It's actually getting out of control. And there isn't enough water or enough pumps. Obviously, we're on the other side. The rhythms are beginning to change now, just the brutality of the cannon and the wheels and the technology taking over. Jeremy's keeping his cool here, but inside he's thinking, oh my God, that flame behind now we can't control because it's now caught the roofs. This is all grass and straw, so there's no way of stopping it. So I had to play this scene knowing that I had to get all the shots we needed using 3 cameras, but there was going to be no going back. And you can see, of course, by the length of the lenses and things that we're bringing the fire up closer than people actually were. It was dangerous. It wasn't so dangerous. Well, that looked pretty dangerous. It wasn't so dangerous that we were really going to risk losing anybody, but my heart was in my mouth. And of course, it would have been an awful thing if we burnt the whole mission down and I didn't have the shots I needed because we couldn't put it back up again. This was our last day. Again, I love just the throwawayness of death, We make it so heroic. It's not, actually. If you see somebody being shot, it's the most unheroic thing I've ever seen. Life goes very quickly, and it's not pretty or heroic. God bless Sam Peckinpah and his slow-motion dying. That's not what it's like. And the violence had to be handled carefully because I just didn't want it to feel melodramatic. I wanted it more to be sort of operatic. I wanted just an immense sadness to start sweeping over us. And the sadness was going to come from this kind of thing. A good plan. And then the small things, small judgments. What do you do now? Do you blow the boy up on the bridge? No, you don't. But was that a good or a bad thing? Maybe it's a question of what you die for, I don't know. In the end, it comes down to that for everybody. Very important. A little human sound cuts through. And he sees what he loves. Now the village is really burning. What's going through their minds, I wonder? See, quite out of control, that fire now. There's no way we could stop it. There, it's got all the roofs. That's a genuine run that's beginning now. When I was shooting the scene, I began to realize that, in a way, a truth that we've probably lost sight of is that there is no more important moment in our lives than the moment that we die, curiously enough, because it's the way we handle that moment that will be the signature of what our life means to us. In the last moments, when there is no more life to be had, don't you want those last moments to be honest? For you, at least. I think that's what I discovered when I shot this scene. That we're so frightened of death that we sometimes don't allow ourselves to understand that it's what gives our life meaning too. So we run away from it. But it's important because other people live after us. So we hand things on. That's the way nature's designed it too. Well, there's no going back to that set anymore. We all ran at this point, and I was helping push the camera dolly, and we were so nervous to get over the bridge because this was really out of control. The dolly fell off into the river. It nearly took 3 of us with it. There I am pontificating about death, and I would have been very upset if I'd died under a dolly. Then we try to make sense of it all. But the sense we try to make just comes out of what we know, what we've learnt, what we want.
And you have the effrontery to tell me that this slaughter was necessary?
I did what I had to do. Given the legitimate purpose which you sanctioned, I would have to say yes. In truth, yes.
You had no alternative, Your Eminence. We must work in the world. The world is thus.
No, Senor Hunter. Thus have we made the world.
Robert and I argued a lot about this moment. Because it's true and not true. We have made our world, but also our world has made us. The fact is, everybody in this scene is right. The real scene is this. Because in a way, this is the world. And maybe that's why we die, so it can begin again. I don't know. But that's what it meant when we got to the end of filming. I think when we shot this scene, although we didn't have Ennio's wonderful music, there was a strange sadness, not only because it was actually the last shot of the movie, and we were going to be leaving that location, but because it's a strange thing, hope and optimism. And we believe that those are the things that make life turn around, and maybe they are, and that's why we put this last little paragraph.
Always, Your Holiness, the spirit of the dead will survive in the memory of the living.
Probably that's all we can ask for. Well, thank you for watching and thank you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed hearing what I feel about this movie as much as I have watching it.